So today in my second sessions, I want to talk about another of my favorite services in Azure, and that is log analytics. And log analytics is known. Does anybody don't know log analytics? So everyone is familiar with log analytics. And then you also know the nice query language called Kusto. And that is also, or that was my starting point when I started with Azure 2017. I worked much more with log analytics, Kusto, build some solutions to put in some Twitter data, make nice analysis over that. So Kusto is very great if you have a lot of data and want to get some data out. Right now or today, regarding GDPR, I guess it would no longer be possible to what I have done years before, but it was legal. So short to myself, I also introduced myself in the session before. Marcel, I'm doing consulting, doing development around Azure Virtual Desktop, building tools, and maybe some of them are known that are WD admin. Hydra is another solution. So I'm working mainly in the end user computing industry, and that since, I cannot say it, 1999, where I did my first project with Citrix on Windows 2000. Yeah, Windows 2000. Where the RDS call was integrated at this time.
And you work for Sapago, do you, Marcel?
I'm working for Sapago for the next 10 days or so, and then that will change. Yes, so log analytics and Kusto. So log analytics is the big data container you can easily deploy in Azure, and you can put in a lot of structured, unstructured data. And log analytics, the service will index all the data, and that makes it possible later to query a lot of data in a very short amount of time. So that is very powerful. I'm not sure if I can make, or if I can compare it to other solutions like, oh no, I miss the words. What Uber Agent is needing for? Splunk. Like Splunk. So that goes in that direction, but that is very cheap, very powerful, but you can only put data in, you cannot really modify data. There is an option to delete data for GDPR compliance, but the main purpose is to put in a lot of data and then query data over a time and show you information you have queried for. You can also build nice visualization on top. So if you have a Kusto query or the query, then you can use that to build nice visualization also in Azure, in the Azure portal, and that also supports nice things like you can drop down into data and the other datas. If you selected one data set before. So that works pretty well, and you can also build own solution which use log analytics as a data store and send data to them directly via the older HTTP data collector API or the newer one, the log ingestion API. But at the end, you are putting data into a log analytic container. From the query, Kusto query language, that is not SQL, otherwise it would be named SQL. But it's very simple. It feels a bit different if you use it the first time, but if you get familiar, it's pretty easy. You start with a table, then you have this pipe, and then you can do a where clause to filter down, you can summarize, you can extend data sets by combining columns or also calculating things, and that in a pretty fast way. So what we will cover today, back to Azure Virtual Desktop, that is what we can get out from the Azure diagnostics logging. And if you're working in Azure, you will find nearly at any Azure resource or resource type an item where you can click on diagnostic settings, where you can configure the logging for this service. So you can log audit logs from SQL database to log analytics or to other things. You can do that for AVD, and that is what we will do today. And the good thing is that gives you insights what is happening in the background. So if something fails, a user cannot connect, I'm pretty sure you will find something in the data tables based on the diagnostic logging of your host pool.
You can also ingest event logs from within the Windows client as well directly into log analytics.
Yeah. Also performance counter.
Yeah.
That is what we will cover not today. That is already covered, AVD Insights, that gives you a good view also to your environment, and also the performance counter event logs collected by the Azure monitoring. We will have a focus today on the AVD backend. Some things are also visualized in the Azure portal, in the AVD Insights, but we will dig into the data and see what is in, and that can help you to create your own queries and help you to figure out what is going wrong or what is going excellent to tell it your manager. To enable diagnostic logging, you can go to the diagnostic settings. In this case, in my host pool with the name design, I switched on all logs, and I also defined a target, store the data, send it to a log analytic workspace, and then I selected my log analytic workspace, and from this time, and it will take a few minutes the first time, Microsoft starts sending this log data into your log analytic workspace, and then you can find it. And if you go then to the log analytic workspace, you can open the table view, and that shows you the different types you related to Azure Virtual Desktop. They are starting still with WVD, but containing your data. I guess that is maybe for that other solution still works, even if they are using the older naming concept. But I don't know. So, for example, WVD connection shows information about connection. If a user connect, you will find at least one entry. If everything went wrong, you will find 3 entries. We will see that later. WVD errors is also very interesting. So mostly you are using the diagnostic logging to figure out what is going wrong. And then this table, WVD errors, is the first table I would try to query to figure out what maybe went wrong. And there are some other tables. And the third important one, from my point of view, is WVD checkpoints. That is a kind of trace logs. So even if you have one entry for a user who tries to log on to AVD, there are a lot of processes in between. Load balancer, can UDP be used, or must it be TCP, and some other things. That is what you can find in the checkpoints log, like a trace log. Very valuable. But there are some challenges. For example, if you go into the tables, you will see different data types. I have some. For example, that is the WVD agent health status. And there is one column that is called allow new sessions. Usually, you would expect, or I would expect, that that is true or false, a binary value. Unfortunately, and you have to handle this is a string. So you will find the word true written or false written in this column. But if you know that, then you can handle that. But that is maybe not expected. Another example, there are some other logs or columns in reporting times about the logon of the user. For example, there is a win logon total time of 5,530 milliseconds, and you can see the quotes that are not numbers in this case. It could be numbers, but there was a decision to not make it as a number. So you have to handle that this number is a string, so you have to also bring it first into a number value before you summarize, before you can build an average. Otherwise it would not work, building an average from a string. So that is what you can find. And then finally, there is also a data set that is reporting the usage of the FS Logics profile. I guess that is at log on or at log off, at one of 2 events. Then you can see the VHD side is 30 gigabytes. There is, in this case, 28 point something gigabytes free. And there are also not numbers that are, what would you guess? Strings in this case. And to make it a bit more complex, the point or comma in between, that is the American notification on how to write numbers. So that is also what you keep in mind. You cannot easily convert it if you have a different number value. For example, in Germany we have a comma for the digits after the main number, and in the US it is a dot. And a bit more complicated is on the VHD size on disk. There you can find the commas for the 1,000 separators in the US and the point for the digits afterwards. So that is also what you have to handle before you build before you build an average, a maximum or minimum. But the good thing is the values are there, maybe not in the expected format. So let us try to dig in. A bit small, the table, so let me open my Azure portal. So that is the view to my host pools. I will use my host pool called design. And then we can see in the diagnostic settings that this is still configured. Otherwise, you can configure it afterwards if you have not directly done this with the creation of the host pool. So in this case, this host pool is sending log data, all logs, to the workspace we have seen before. Then let us go to the log analytic workspace. Zoom a bit more in. That is the last one. Then we can go to logs. And here the part where we can write our custom logs or Kusto queries. So I prepared one to not type in everything again. AVD diagnostic demo. Is that visible? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So on the top, what you ever have to select is a time range. So log analytics, all the query are based over a time range. You can select whatever you want. Inside of the time frame, you have configured where log analytics is storing data. By default, that is 1 month, and you can extend it to 2 years. Yeah, or 3?
I don't know.
2 years. So you can extend it to 2 years. And then you can also query about all the data in the past. You can select it here, the last X days, or a custom range. For example, if you want to get the data last Friday where something weird happens, then you can do it from the 12th to the 14th. Keep in mind that if you store the data for longer than a month, it costs a bit more. But overall, I would say that is a cheap value to store data, and you also get the performance to then query the data. So let us do for the last 7 days. And I would first start, and everything I mark, that is what I run in the query. So if I run a query to the WVD connections, I should get back a lot of lines from user connecting to my AVD environment. Let me grab one, or let me do it later. A simple query is, if I do it again, query WVD connection, and then the pipe for the next parameter of my query would distinct. And distinct means I would get the distinct usernames back who logged on in the last 7 days. And that would be usually my test user and my admin user. So that is an easy way to work with a lot of data. So last 7 days, a lot of log on, and you have seen the query runs pretty fast. We can also count the number of distinct user by starting again. It starts from the top, the table, WVD connections with all the data, then only the distinct user, like seen here, and then the count, and that gives us back a number, 30 users or 30 distinct users connected in the last 7 days to my environment. So let me run WVD connections again, and let me copy one of the important things, that is the correlation ID. The correlation ID is always the same for the same event. Or let me say it in this way. For example, if a user connects or start to connect, that is an entry. Then the next would be he is connected. And let me do that to filter one. And maybe another one if the user disconnect or log off. So this user, WVD028, he started a connection at this time on the left side. So time generated is always in the data set and related to the time range we have selected. Then after a few seconds, the user was connected, so the session was established. And then later, 2 hours later, the user logged off or disconnected the session. And over the full time of this session, the user keeps the same correlation ID. And also, if the user run into an error, We could also use this correlation ID to find this in the error logs. Or in the opposite direction, if you look in the errors, we can copy the correlation ID and find the connections for the user, or also the trace log. So we have a lot of data in, and let me open one of the data set. If I click on that, then we get it one by one. You can see, for example, we have the username. We have the state, like completed, logged off. We know what was a client operating system. With the version, we also know, and that is very interesting, the client IP address and some other data like the session host name. We will find the host pool name also in this. That is part later on the bottom called _resource ID. So a lot of data in, and sometimes it's very helpful if we see that something is went wrong, that we filter it or count the errors maybe by the session host agent version. So that could give us some insight. Is it maybe related to a specific host, to a specific host pool, to a specific client or so? So let me do another query. So I would query again the WWD connection for the state connected and would only show username, client-side IP address, and session host. That is what I can do with the word project in front. So that gave me now back what we expect: user, client IP address, and the session host. And interesting is the client IP address. So that is a public-facing IP address, the internet IP address, and that can give you back information about the location of the user. And inside of log analytics with the Kusto query language, there is one command that is called geoinfo from IP address. So that is built in the Microsoft solution. And if I feed that with the client IP address, I get some information about the location of the user, so where the user connected from. And that is very helpful to figure out, in case of a disruption, if maybe users from a single city or country are affected. So I run this query and we get again the username, client IP address, and then the location, Netherlands, Amsterdam. In this case, I logged on user from Azure to Azure. That is the reason why everything is Netherlands. Then my user from Germany, Rösrath, that is 10 kilometers away, so also okay. And if you run that in your environment, that would be very interesting. Then you would see all the different cities where users are connecting from. So a bit more than I have here in my demo environment. But that is very powerful. My first start was to use external services and to bring it into log analytics, but it's much easier after I found out that that is still built in from Microsoft. And here you can also see, if I open one location, and then you can see there is some data more in. There's also latitude, longitude in, if that is needed. But very powerful, this geoinfo from IP. So what else do we have? So another point is that, as I mentioned before, that is the checkpoints. And checkpoints is like a trace log. If I run that, we get a lot of data back. And we also have the correlation ID in. And if we want to get some data for a specific user, like the user I have chosen before, copying in his correlation ID, then I get all the data related to the user's login, work on the session host, and later disconnect or log off. And you can see that is a lot of things. What happens if a user tries to log on? And if we go to the right, you can see it goes from the bottom to the top in the timely order. First, Microsoft Load Balancer decide, is it a user who want to reconnect to a session, or is it a new user? In this case, it was a new user. Then you get the information, new session. And that is very helpful. You can see every single step in the background of Microsoft, what happens before the user connect. You can also see if he type in his password again, if the protocol is TCP or UDP, what was maybe the reason why UDP is not working, and some nice parameter we have seen before, profile logged on with the duration of the log on process. We have another table that shows you how long does loading the profile took, how long the GPO processing took, if you have a GPO, and all other things. So that is very valuable. And if you take a closer look, you will see that are the things I have shown before with these quotes. So that are numbers which you must convert first. But then that is very useful. Profile.
Can you query directly, say like the duration, milliseconds, or follow up?
Yeah, that is possible.
You can actually just query that specifically.
That is possible. I can extract the data directly from the JSON string, convert it to a number so that I can work with it afterwards, and then I can see it directly. So profiles log. So here we were here. I have an example profile log off. Here's a query where I ask the checkpoints for the name profile log off. In this line, I have the data in for the VHD free space, less than 30 gigabyte. Maybe not the smartest query. Should be everything, but we see we nothing get back because free space is not a number. And here's another one. This line makes a number from this Microsoft number type called string number. So it so it converts the thousand, the delimiters for the thousands with a comma and the dots for the decimal values. So at the end, that gives me then a number, and then I get some data back. And then we can see free space is now calculated, I would say correctly, with the number. Yeah, that is a bit complicated, but working. So what do else we have? Let me skip something.
You really shouldn't have to do that, Marcel. I'm going to do something about that.
But I gave, as expected, I gave feedback to the program manager, and he really appreciated it. But I think that it's not too easy to change it now, but it could break things. Yeah, that is always a challenge. So most important are WBD errors. So if I run this, I get a lot of errors. I had the last 7 days in my environment. And important is also the correlation ID to bind it to a connection. But more important is the code symbolic. That gives you an information what was the reason. And let me filter down the distinct code symbolics in my environment. So what happens on different error messages in the last 7 days. And that are some, not all what are possible, but the errors I had. And important to know is, and let me count how often that happens per error message. Interesting, 10 not found DB error. I didn't expect that. Let me increase it. I wanted to see another error. So, count. So there are not any error message listed here is an error. For example, here is one on position 2 that is called connection failed, client disconnected. That exactly happens if I close my notebook and go at home. So if I disconnect my session, that is listed as an error here. So what I recommend if I'm on the customer side, filtering on errors which are real errors, and for example, not using this error message. Well, that often happens that users in the evening closing the notebooks or clicking on the X on the top, but not logging off. That is not a real error. There are other things which are not really errors. For example, if a user types the password wrong, and in the second step it works, then that is listed, but maybe not so important. The most important I'm filtering on, that is on my first line. If that happens, you have an issue. That is connection failed, no healthy RDS age available, no session host is available. That happens if users try to connect, also with Power on Connect, and there is no session host which is able to where the user can connect to, while there is no free session on the host, while there is no session host which could be started by Power on Connect, then you will exactly find this error message. So what I mostly do at customer is exactly building an alert for this error message. If that happens, then something is wrong. Auto-scaling not working, not enough hosts, Power on Connect not working. So that would be a good trigger to check what is going wrong. And you can see how nice it is with Kusto to first summarize, also to count the errors by error name. So that gives you these nice tables. Here I filtered it also down, WD error, where the code symbolic is exactly this with this no remote desktop session host available. And in the data set itself is not the host pool directly visible. Let me run WD errors once to show a full data set. Here are a lot of things in, but the session host name, host pool name, that is here on the right in this resource ID. And that is also what we can nicely filter or grab with the Kusto query language. So if you do it this way, I would split the resource ID, would get the 8th part, which is the host pool name, and then I also get the number of errors related to no session host available by the host pool names. Oh, sorry, by the usernames and host pool names. And you can do that also, write it over time, etc. Let me check what is also interesting. What we also can find in the data, and that is interesting, WWD connection network data, and that gives you information about the estimated round trip time, so the latency, the estimated, and also that is maybe not so useful, the available bandwidth for the user, not the use bandwidth. But the latency, that is important. I'm using that to figure out if a user may have trouble because he has a slow network connection or a bad network connection. So if that is higher than 200 milliseconds, I would bet the user will feel it. And let me extend one of the data sets. Do you know what is missing here in this kind of data set for this 69 milliseconds round trip time? We have the host pool name in, but the user is missing here. And it would be interesting to get an idea the latency by username. And while we have the correlation ID and we know that we can find the user logon in the other table, we can connect, and that looks a bit complex, and it is maybe complex on the first view. So we are getting the network data, the latency, and then we joining another table by the correlation ID to grab the username from the other table to have it then in our overall table. So now I have the usernames. I also have my client-side IP address and then the average latency for this user from the specific IP addresses. And you can also bring it down to a session host if you want to do that. And it should also be possible to directly do that for a specific user, like my WVD009. And what we also can do is we can render nice charts in my log directly here into the query interface, which shows me the latency for the user over time. So let me come back.
Do you know, is there anything like SQL report writer or anything like that where you can have a custom query that's running on a schedule when emails out? Or?
That is possible. I am doing that for one customer. We are doing that for alerting for this no RDSH host available. And you can do that by, or the alerting that can be done with an Azure Alert, but you can also use, I'm searching for the name, I didn't get it directly, where you can, in Azure, build different tasks one by one and then have an action, logic app. That also has an interface. So you can write your Kusto query in the logic app, get something, a table, and send it via mail. That's also possible.
You can do it with Power Automate, Power and the function app and like a lot of stuff.
So Kusto is very cool. What you also can do, I mentioned it before, you can build nice charts. For example, in this, usernames, the average latency, bandwidth in a list. So that is built based on a Kusto query. You can do what we have seen before also. That is a special item in Log Analytics called workbooks. You can also build a visualization with a line chart showing you also the round trip time for a user based, in this case, on an IP address. What else? Some other views where you see a list of users and also a chart on top. Donut charts, bar charts, and I think really interesting, and that is maybe not so well known, you can create this table, for example, and add some parameters on top, where you can select, for example, and that is also built from another Kusto query. I query first what host pools were sent data in the last X days. Then I list the host pool. The user can select it, and then all the other charts are then filtering down the values or the results to this host pool. That is also possible. And my favorite one is this one. You have a table on top. The user clicked on this username where the user had an average log-on time of 6.7 seconds. And then with a click, another table opens for this user, and then showing the distinct sessions the user had in the time, and no longer the average log-on time, then the single values, log-on total, GPO, profile load time, etc. And that is really valuable if you try to figure out why is a log-on slow. So that can help you. And it's also pretty easy to start. I would start creating a Kusto query, which gives you the data you are looking for. And then you can open another tab in your browser and starting with creating the visualization, building this workbook. And workbook means you add an item, a Kusto query, and then you select what do you want to show, a table, a line chart, donut chart. So it's pretty easy to start with, or even more easier is to use an existing workbook and click on the modify, because each workbook can be modified, and maybe modify the existing workbook or copy some things out which are already down. And we will see that also in a minute. So let me show you what I prepared. I'm working for a while with log analytics and with Kusto, and what I built, so I go again to my log analytic workspace, to workbooks where we can build our own workbooks or using existing workbooks. That is this one. That's also downloadable from my blog for free, of course, and that has some of the queries I have shown before integrated. And you have different tabs like connection, data about errors, log on timing, FS logics, resources. Also interesting to figure out if you have this kind of orphan resources. And what you also did, or what you then do is select a time range, last 7 days, and then we get some information about the distinct users. Here is the query in where the users comes from, connected from, how often. We can click on this user, then another table opens for this WVD 018. He had 3 connections, then we can see the distinct 3 connection with some information, when it started, how long the log-on was, and so on. And that is a pretty easy approach to start with AVD and also with Kusto query, because you can click on edit and then copy any query out and modify it or build your own workbook. Errors is interesting, showing you the errors over time and also the error by reasons. So the most, in my case, was cancelled, then tenant not found, whatever that means. I have to Google that later. And then also errors by client ID. Sometimes you may figure out that specific clients from an Apple have more or less issues than others. That would be interesting. Or even in this case, I can see how many connections were successful or had errors related to an IP segment. That could be helpful. Maybe that makes more sense to bring it down to the city or so. And also what I have seen is errors by session host agent. So that is the piece of software running on the virtual machine. Not working. That could also be helpful to figure out if you have some issues, if that is maybe related to a specific version of the AVD agent. Interesting, and I'm not sure why that happens, there's one AVD agent reporting a strange release number at the same time. Maybe a preview pool. And you will find also the part of the logon timing, the username, how long does a logon took. And if I click on that, the next table appears at the bottom, like we have seen before. And then you can see the distinct sessions and also the part of the log-on event, which took maybe more or less time. In this case, I would say that everything is fine, everything is green. Otherwise, you would see it in orange or red. And that goes up to the FS logics. There is also a query which you could use as an alert in Azure to get alerted. If the free size on the profile maybe gets low. So I have all my users, also by the host pool name, but I usually have one profile per host pool and don't mix them up with VHD size or with VHD free space. That is important. And the usage 42%, so 70 gigabyte out of 30 for my user. And that is what you can get from the diagnostic logs if you convert the numbers with the new method, Microsoft string number format to real number. Don't tell it anyone. And finally, but that works a bit different, that is resources. And in resources, you can find something like often session host, often virtual machines. And often means, in this case, you can have a virtual machine, which should be a session host, but the session host object no longer exists. If you go in the Azure Virtual Desktop portal on a session host and click on delete, the session host object is deleted, but not the virtual machine that stays there. And it's also mentioned in the description, but if you don't think about it and the virtual machine is maybe running, you will maybe see it after weeks, after getting an invoice, while you have to pay for a running virtual machine, which you are not using as AVD session host anymore. So that would be an option. Another option is you delete the virtual machine, but the session host object still stays. That don't cost you money, but if Microsoft tries to start the virtual the session host by autoscaling, that will not work while the virtual machine no longer exists. And that is showing here in this table. It compares the session host objects and the virtual machine, and if the link is broken. So that is what you can see here, which means often virtual machine, often session host, unresponding AVD agent. That could also happen. So if an AVD session host is down for 90 days or longer, and that can happen with personal hosts sometimes, then a token times out and the virtual machine is started, but cannot connect to the AVD backend. So it seems to be unavailable, but it's also running maybe in the background. And that can also give you a hint here. And the other thing that is easy, I would say, I have some often things, network adapters without virtual machines, so I could delete them. Or, oh, that's not nice. Because that costs money. Often disks, you have to pay for each disk based as a premium or HDD between $5 and $20 a month. And I have 2, 4, 6, 7 unattached disks, which I will delete after the session because it costs money and don't brings me anything. But not if it is maybe a backup, then that could be fine. So that helps you also, and that is querying with the Kusto query language, not the data in the log analytic workspace. That is querying the Azure resource graph, but with the same query language. And then let me come back.
Is that workbook is available for a copy?
Yeah. Let me also end with that, and I will skip the alerting part and how to build your own solution, sending data to log analytics. But you will find it in the slides, which will be available for download. So that is the workbook we have seen before. You can find it on my blog, download it, and then that is installed. Installed means the description, how the workbook looks like, and the queries behind is installed in your environment, and then you can see your data with the queries behind the visualization. And with this, I would say thank you again. Here's also the QR code for the app.
If people want to get started with KQL and obviously not as expert as Marcel is, Copilot is really, really good at creating KQL query language for you. So it's a really good way to get started.
That's not really good what you told me before. Pretty cool.
So what Marcel's referencing is that inside Microsoft, we have a special Copilot agent. So if you have the ability to view the data, you can, that agent is specifically for our set of Kusto data. So instead of writing any KQL queries at all, I can write in natural language. In the last 7 days, please give me any long connection rates or any errors, and put them in a table with username and IP address, and it will just spit out the stuff that Marcel's talking about. So you don't even need to write KQL.
What was the last session I did with it after that? It goes live. Any question to Kusto, Log Analytic, AVD in this combination? Otherwise, feel free to catch me afterwards. There's a lot of stuff, and I could make a full day out of them, and it makes really fun. But let me say thank you, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.